Modern militaries don't lose $240 million surveillance platforms to air defenses they already know about. They lose them to the ones they don't. February 9th, 2026. 2:14 Zulu time. An MQ-4C Triton, the U.S. Navy's most advanced high-altitude unmanned surveillance aircraft, vanished from every tracking system simultaneously. No distress signal, no degraded telemetry, no partial data link. 1 second it existed at 56,000 feet above the central Iranian plateau. The next second, it didn't. The crew at Naval Air Station Point Mugu in Ventura County, California, stared at a blank screen. The Triton's icon, call sign Borealis 7, had been steady for 11 hours. Now it was gone. 17 seconds of silence in the ground control station. Then the mission commander said 2 words that would trigger a chain of events reaching the Oval Office within 90 minutes. Borealis down. I'm your host at Battlefront Signal, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Today, we're reconstructing the loss of one of the most expensive unmanned aircraft in the U.S. military's inventory, and the intelligence failure that made it possible. Because this wasn't a mechanical malfunction, it wasn't pilot error, there was no pilot, and it wasn't a random shoot-down by an outdated surface-to-air missile battery running on Cold War technology. This was a deliberate, calculated engagement by an Iranian air defense system that wasn't supposed to be where it was. A system that had been moved 72 hours earlier to a location U.S. intelligence hadn't updated on any planning chart, any target package, or any ISR deconfliction map. The MQ-4C Triton costs $240 million per airframe. It flies at altitudes above 55,000 feet. It carries the most sophisticated multi-function active sensor suite ever mounted on an unmanned platform. AN/ZA-PY-3, a 360-degree radar that can track ships, vehicles, and aircraft across an area the size of 2 million square nautical miles in a single sortie. The Navy operates 5 of these aircraft in the Pacific, and 3 in the Central Command area of responsibility. Borealis 7 was one of those 3. It was flying a 12-hour orbital surveillance track designated Iron Carpet, a persistent ISR loop covering western and central Iran from the Zagros Mountains to the Dashti Kavir Salt Desert. The mission was routine. Iron Carpet had been flown 41 times since October 2025 without incident. The same orbital pattern, the same altitude block between 54,000 and 57,000 feet. The same sensor suite parameters. 41 times the Triton flew that loop. 41 times it came home. The 42nd time, it didn't. To understand why, you need to understand what was happening on the ground in Iran, and what Washington thought was happening versus what was actually happening. Since the strikes of June 2025, when US B-2 bombers destroyed Iran's primary nuclear enrichment facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, Tehran had been rebuilding. Not its nuclear program, its air defense network. The Islamic Republic's integrated air defense system, known internally as Khatam al-Anbiya, had taken severe damage during the 12-day conflict. Israeli and American electronic warfare operations had degraded Iranian radar coverage across 60% of the country. Dozens of older Tor M1 and S-200 batteries were destroyed outright. But the crown jewel, the Bavar 373, survived. The Bavar 373 is Iran's indigenous long-range air defense system. Western analysts have compared it to the Russian S-300PMU-2, but that comparison undersells what the Iranians have done with it. The Bavar 373 uses a Mirage 4 phased array engagement radar capable of tracking up to 100 targets simultaneously. Its Sayyad 4B interceptor missiles have a published engagement ceiling of 93,000 feet and a maximum range of 300 kilometers. 56,000 feet, the Triton's operating altitude is well within the Bavar 373's engagement envelope. The U.S. military knew this. Every ISR planner at 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain knew exactly what the Bavar 373 could do. That's why Iron Carpet's orbital track was designed to avoid known Bavar 373 positions. The route threaded between confirmed battery locations, maintaining a lateral offset of at least 80 nautical miles from any identified Bavar 373 deployment. The critical word in that sentence is identified. As of February 6, 2026, U.S. intelligence tracked 4 operational Bavar 373 batteries, 1 near Isfahan, 1 near Tehran, 1 covering the Strait of Hormuz approaches, and 1 northwest of Shiraz. The intelligence was current. It was verified by satellite imagery taken on February 3rd. It was cross-referenced with signals intelligence from NSA listening posts in Bahrain and Qatar. It was confirmed by human intelligence assets reporting from inside the Iranian military supply chain. 4 batteries, 4 known locations. The Iron Carpet route avoided all of them. The problem was that there weren't 4 batteries anymore, there were 5. Iran had activated a 5th Bavar 373 battery, one that U.S. intelligence had assessed as non-operational. It had been sitting in a depot near Semnan, northeast of Tehran, since November 2025. DIA analysts had classified it as assembly stage non-deployable, based on satellite imagery showing missing radar components and incomplete launcher vehicles. That assessment was wrong. The missing components weren't missing. They were being installed in a covered facility that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate. The incomplete launchers weren't incomplete. They were being deliberately displayed in a partially assembled state as deception, a technique Iranian air defense forces had refined since studying how American intelligence analyzed their deployments during the 2025 strikes. By January 28, 2026, the 5th battery was fully operational. On February 6th, 72 hours before the Triton's final flight, it moved. Not to the outskirts of Semnan, where analysts might have noticed a short-range repositioning. Not to a prepared site with visible infrastructure signatures. It moved 340 kilometers south, across the Dasht-e-Kavir Desert, to an unprepared position near the town of Anarak. Anarak sits directly under the Iron Carpet orbital track. The Iranians moved a fully operational long-range air defense battery across 340 kilometers of desert in 48 hours, set it up in a location with no permanent infrastructure, and powered it on, all without triggering a single intelligence alert. How? 3 factors, each one a failure, each one preventable. First, timing. The battery moved on the night of February 6th, during a 12-hour gap between National Reconnaissance Office satellite passes. Iran's military had been tracking American satellite schedules. Orbital mechanics aren't secret, and Tehran had invested heavily in counterspace awareness since 2025. They knew when the gap existed. They moved inside it. Second, signatures. The convoy that relocated the battery used civilian heavy-haul trucks instead of military TEL vehicles. Satellite imagery the following day showed increased commercial truck traffic on the Semnan-Anarak highway, but an automated image intelligence classifier flagged it as routine commercial movement. Confidence high. No human analyst reviewed the imagery for 47 hours. By the time someone looked at it, the battery was already in position, camouflaged, and the trucks were gone. Third, emissions. The relocated Bavar 373 maintained complete electromagnetic silence from the moment it left Semnan until the moment it engaged the Triton. No radar emissions, no communication signals, no electronic signatures of any kind. The battery operated under a protocol the Iranians called khamush, silence. It received targeting data not from its own radar, but from a network of passive sensors and forward observer posts that fed coordinates through buried fiber optic lines. The Triton never saw it because the Bavar 373 never turned on its radar until the final engagement sequence. And by then, there were 9 seconds between radar activation and missile impact. 9 seconds. At 56,000 feet, traveling at 310 knots, the Triton covered roughly half a nautical mile in those 9 seconds. Its electronic support measures, the MQ-4C, detected the Mirage 4 radar pulse. The onboard threat library correctly identified the emission as a BAVAR 373 engagement radar. The system began calculating an evasive maneuver. It never completed the calculation. The Sayed-4B missile reached the Triton's altitude in approximately 41 seconds after launch. The engagement radar had been active for only the final 9 seconds of that flight. The rest of the trajectory was guided by inertial navigation, updated by passive tracking data from the ground network. At 2:14:07 Zulu, the missile's proximity fuse detonated the 60-kilogram fragmentation warhead, approximately 15 meters from the Triton's fuselage. The drone's composite airframe, designed for aerodynamic efficiency, not survivability, shattered. Borealis 7 fell from 56,000 feet in pieces. The largest fragment, a section of the port wing measuring roughly 4 meters, impacted the desert floor 11 minutes later, approximately 40 kilometers southeast of Anorak. The wreckage field stretched across 19 square kilometers. In the ground control station at Point Mugu, the crew processed what had happened in stages. The first reaction was disbelief. The Triton had never been shot down before. No MQ-4C had ever been lost to enemy action. The RQ-4 Global Hawk, the Triton's Air Force predecessor, had been shot down once over the Strait of Hormuz in June 2019 by an Iranian surface-to-air missile. But that aircraft was flying at a lower altitude, on a more predictable path, and Iran's air defenses had improved dramatically since then. The mission commander immediately initiated the Quick Draw Protocol, the classified reporting chain for loss of a high-value ISR asset in a combat zone. Within 4 minutes, 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain was notified. Within 11 minutes, the Joint Operations Center at the Pentagon received the initial report. Within 22 minutes, the commander of U.S. Central Command, General Raymond Torres, was on a secure video call with the ground control station. His first question: was it mechanical or hostile? The answer came from the telemetry. In the final 2 seconds of data before link loss, the Triton's threat warning system had recorded a single BAVAR 373 engagement radar pulse. The ALQ-240's threat log, transmitted in a burst data packet 1.3 seconds before signal loss, confirmed hostile engagement. General Torres asked a second question, the one that mattered. Why was the Triton inside a BAVAR 373 engagement envelope? The silence in the ground control station lasted longer than it should have, because the answer was, it shouldn't have been. According to every intelligence product, every ISR route plan, every threat assessment published in the previous 30 days, there was no BAVAR 373 within 300 kilometers of the Iron Carpet track at that point. The route had been certified as low threat. The mission had been approved through the standard deconfliction process. Every box was checked. Every box was wrong. Within 3 hours, a damage assessment team at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency pulled archived satellite imagery of the Anorak area. They found it on imagery from February 7th, 2 days before the shootdown. A cluster of vehicles parked in a wadi, partially concealed by camouflage netting. At the time the imagery was collected, the automated system had flagged it as possible nomadic encampment. Low priority. It wasn't a nomadic encampment. It was a fully deployed BAVAR 373 battery with 4 launcher vehicles, a Mirage 4 engagement radar, a command post vehicle, and 2 ammunition resupply trucks. The imagery had been available for 47 hours before the shootdown. No one had looked at it. Here's the question that should keep every ISR planner awake. How did the system fail at every level simultaneously? Comment Borealis if you think the intelligence community should have caught this. The failure wasn't in any single system. It was in the architecture. The U.S. Navy's ISR planning for the Iran theater relied on a threat database called CENTCOM Integrated Threat Picture, CITP. This database aggregated intelligence from satellites, signals intercepts, human sources, and open-source data. It was updated every 24 hours by a team at the Combined Air Operations Center in Al Udeid, Qatar. 24 hours. That update cycle was established in 2019. It was adequate for tracking Iranian air defense positions that moved once every 6 to 12 months. It was not adequate for tracking a military that had learned to move an entire air defense battery across 300 kilometers in 48 hours. The CITP had another problem. It categorized threats in a binary system: confirmed active or assessed non-operational. There was no intermediate category for potentially mobile or status uncertain. The 5th Bavar 373 battery was listed as assessed non-operational, based on the November 2025 satellite imagery, showing it in partial assembly at the Semnan depot. That assessment was never revisited. No analyst was tasked with re-examining it. The system didn't flag static assessments for periodic review. Once a threat was categorized as non-operational, it effectively disappeared from the planning process. The Triton flew into an engagement envelope that didn't exist on any chart because the system was designed around the assumption that Iran's air defenses were predictable. They were predictable until they weren't. General Torres ordered an immediate halt to all manned and unmanned ISR flights over Iranian territory. The Iron Carpet orbit was suspended. 2 other surveillance tracks, Stone Bridge over southwestern Iran and Glass Horizon over the Strait of Hormuz approaches, were pulled back to a minimum of 150 nautical miles from Iranian airspace. The intelligence gap was immediate and severe. Without the Triton's persistent surveillance, Fifth Fleet lost its primary source of real-time tracking data on Iranian naval movements in the Persian Gulf. The Triton had been providing continuous maritime domain awareness, ship tracking, small boat movements, port activity monitoring, across an area covering the entire northern Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. That coverage vanished overnight. The Navy attempted to fill the gap with other assets. P-8. A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft flew supplementary missions from Al Udeid and Bahrain. But the P-8A operates at much lower altitudes, typically between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, and within range of shorter-range Iranian air defense systems. Each P-8A mission required dedicated electronic warfare escort and fighter coverage from carrier-based EA-18G Growlers and FA-18E Super Hornets. The cost of replacing a single Triton orbit with manned aircraft: 14 additional sorties per day, 42 additional flight hours, approximately $4 million in daily operational costs. And each of those manned flights put human aircrew at risk in ways the unmanned Triton never did. The Pentagon's public response came 36 hours after the loss. A written statement from Naval Air Systems Command described the incident as an MQ-4C Triton mishap during routine operations in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. No mention of hostile fire. No mention of Iran. No mention of the Bavar 373. The statement said the incident was under investigation and that the flight data recorder location has been classified under operational security protocols. There was no flight data recorder to recover. It was in pieces across 19 square kilometers of Iranian desert. The classification of the incident report triggered immediate pushback from the Senate Armed Services Committee. 3 senators, 2 Democrats, and 1 Republican sent a classified letter to the Secretary of the Navy demanding a full briefing within 14 days. The letter, whose existence was reported by defense journalists though its contents remained classified, reportedly asked why the Triton was operating over an area where intelligence on air defense deployments was outdated by more than 72 hours. The briefing happened on February 27, 2026, in a secure facility on Capitol Hill. According to sources familiar with the session, it lasted 4 hours. The senior intelligence officer presenting the timeline was interrupted multiple times by senators demanding to know why the 24-hour threat update cycle hadn't been shortened after Iran demonstrated mobile air defense capabilities during the 2025 conflict. The officer reportedly answered that the update cycle was constrained by satellite availability and analyst capacity, that there simply weren't enough satellites in orbit to provide continuous coverage, and not enough trained imagery analysts to process the data faster than every 24 hours. One senator responded, "So, we sent a $250 million drone into hostile airspace based on intelligence that was at least 3 days old, and nobody in the chain of command thought that was a problem." No satisfactory answer was provided. The operational consequences extended beyond the immediate loss of ISR coverage. The shootdown demonstrated that Iran had developed a capability the U.S. intelligence community had been warning about in theory but hadn't validated in practice. Shoot and scoot air defense. Shoot and scoot is a tactical concept where a mobile air defense battery fires on a target and then immediately relocates before the enemy can locate and destroy it. Russian forces employed this technique with S-300 and S-400 systems in Ukraine. The Iranians had been studying those operations closely, but Iran added a layer the Russians hadn't used effectively: passive to active handoff. The Bavar 373 at Anorak operated for 72 hours using only passive sensors. No radar emissions at all. It received its targeting data from a distributed network of observers and passive electronic sensors. Only in the final seconds of the engagement did it activate its own radar. This meant the Triton's electronic warfare systems, designed to detect and geolocate active radar emitters, had nothing to detect. The drone was flying over a fully armed air defense battery that, from an electromagnetic perspective, didn't exist. The implication for future operations was devastating. If Iran could deploy Bavar 373 batteries covertly, operate them passively, and activate them only at the moment of engagement, then every ISR route over Iran was potentially compromised. Every flight path that had been certified as safe based on known radar positions was now uncertain. The assumption that U.S. electronic intelligence could provide adequate warning of air defense threats, an assumption baked into every ISR mission plan since the 1991 Gulf War, was no longer valid. The Triton shootdown also had immediate diplomatic consequences. Iran's state media confirmed the engagement within hours, broadcasting footage of what they claimed was the wreckage of an American surveillance drone recovered from the desert near Anorak. The footage showed fragments of composite material and a section of the Triton's distinctive V-tail assembly partially burned. Tehran presented the shootdown as a major military achievement, evidence that Iranian air defenses could defeat American surveillance technology. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement calling the engagement a message to all those who violate Iranian sovereignty. State television ran a 3-part documentary on the Bavar 373 system within a week, including interviews with the battery commander who authorized the engagement. Washington's position was untenable. The Pentagon couldn't confirm the shootdown without acknowledging that a U.S. military aircraft had been operating over Iranian territory, a fact that, while widely assumed, had never been officially stated. The mishap narrative was transparently false, but the alternative, admitting that Iran had successfully engaged and destroyed a frontline U.S. intelligence platform, carried its own risks. The intelligence community assessed that acknowledging the shootdown publicly would validate Iran's investment in mobile air defense and potentially accelerate similar programs in other adversary nations. China, in particular, was closely monitoring the incident. The PLA's Strategic Support Force reportedly requested detailed technical briefings from Iranian counterparts within 72 hours of the shootdown. Subscribe if you want to understand how these events reshape military strategy around the world. Inside the Pentagon, the Triton loss triggered a classified review designated Operation Clean Lens. The review, led by the Director of Naval Intelligence, examined every assumption underpinning ISR operations in the CENTCOM theater. The preliminary findings, delivered in mid-March 2026, identified 7 critical failures. The first and most consequential, the intelligence community had applied a static analysis framework to a dynamic threat environment. Iranian air defense forces had fundamentally changed their operational concept between June 2025 and February 2026, shifting from fixed, permanent defensive positions to mobile, dispersed, and deceptive deployments. U.S. intelligence had not updated its analytical models to account for this shift. The second finding, the 24-hour CITP update cycle, created a structural vulnerability that adversaries could exploit. Any military capable of relocating assets faster than the update cycle could effectively become invisible to the threat database. The third finding, over-reliance on automated image classification, had removed human judgment from the intelligence chain at a critical juncture. The satellite imagery from February 7th that showed the Bavar 373 battery at Anorak was correctly collected, correctly stored, and correctly processed by the automated system. The automated system simply got the classification wrong, and no human ever checked. The fourth finding, and the one that generated the most controversy, was that the Triton's mission profile itself had become predictable. 41 consecutive flights on the same orbital track, the same altitude block, with the same sensor parameters. The Iranians didn't need to hack American communications or recruit a spy. They just needed to watch the sky. Any competent air defense officer who observed the same high-altitude track appearing every 72 hours could calculate the orbit, predict the next passage, and position a battery underneath it. That's not intelligence genius. That's pattern recognition. The Triton Program Office at Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake was directed to develop randomized orbital patterns, variable altitudes, variable ground tracks, variable timing, that would prevent adversaries from predicting future ISR passes. The modification was estimated to require 4 months of software development and flight testing. 4 months during which the remaining 2 Tritons in the CENTCOM theater would continue flying predictable patterns or not fly at all. General Torres chose not to fly. The stand-down of Triton operations over Iran forced the Navy to rethink its entire surveillance architecture for the Persian Gulf theater. The service had invested heavily in the Triton as a replacement for the aging EP-3E Ares, signals intelligence aircraft, and as a complement to the P-8A Poseidon. The concept was simple. The Triton flies high, sees far, stays persistent. It provides the broad area surveillance that enables everything else: carrier operations, submarine movements, amphibious planning. Without it, the Navy was operating partially blind in one of the most contested maritime environments on Earth. The gap was felt most acutely in the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian fast attack craft, armed with anti-ship cruise missiles and operating from camouflaged coastal positions, had increased their activity since the 2025 conflict. The Triton had been tracking these movements in near real time, providing early warning to U.S. and Allied warships transiting the strait. That early warning was now gone. On February 19th, 10 days after the Triton loss, an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy fast attack squadron conducted a simulated swarm attack on a commercial tanker in the eastern approach to the strait. 14 boats, moving at 45 knots. The first indication came from a P-8A that happened to be in the area on a separate mission. By the time the patrol aircraft reported the activity, the Iranian boats were already within 8 nautical miles of the tanker. No weapons were fired. The Iranians broke off after 20 minutes, but the incident made clear what the loss of persistent ISR coverage meant in practical terms: less warning time, smaller reaction windows, greater risk. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, operating in the Gulf of Oman, shifted its combat air patrol posture. Instead of maintaining 2 F/A-18E Super Hornets on station for fleet air defense, the group now kept 4 aircraft airborne, 2 for air defense and 2 configured for maritime surveillance, carrying targeting pods and infrared sensors to partially compensate for the Triton's absence. The increased sortie rate put additional strain on an air wing already flying at elevated tempo. Maintenance hours per flight hour increased. Pilot fatigue accumulated. The Eisenhower's Air Department estimated that the current tempo was sustainable for approximately 60 days before aircraft availability would begin to decline due to deferred maintenance. 60 days. That clock started on February 9th. By early April 2026, the Eisenhower would face a choice: reduce flight operations or accept increasing mechanical risk to its aircraft. Meanwhile, the wreckage of Borealis 7 remained in Iranian hands. The Pentagon assessed that Iran would attempt to exploit whatever technology could be recovered from the debris. The MQ-4C Triton carries some of the most sensitive surveillance equipment in the U.S. military's inventory. The AN/ZPY-3 radar, the electro-optical/infrared sensor suite, the communications relay package, the electronic support measure system. Much of this equipment would have been damaged or destroyed by the missile impact and the 11-minute fall from 56,000 feet. But not all of it. Intelligence assessments indicated that portions of the sensor payload, particularly circuit boards, wiring harnesses, and antenna components, could survive impact forces if they landed in soft desert sand. Iran's recovery teams were on site within hours. Commercial satellite imagery from February 10th showed approximately 30 vehicles and 100 personnel systematically searching the debris field in a grid pattern. They were thorough, they were organized, they had clearly practiced this. The technology exploitation concern wasn't limited to Iran. Within a week, Russian technical specialists, likely from the GRU's Signals Intelligence Directorate, were reportedly observed at the recovery site. China's presence was more discreet but confirmed through signals intelligence intercepts that referenced anorak material samples being discussed on encrypted channels between Tehran and Beijing. The Triton's loss became a technology transfer event. Whatever Iran recovered, it would share or sell. The long-term strategic implications are still unfolding. The Clean Lens Review recommended a fundamental restructuring of how the Navy conducts ISR in contested environments. The core recommendation: eliminate single-platform dependency. Instead of relying on one or two high-value drones flying predictable patterns, the Navy should deploy swarms of smaller, cheaper, expendable unmanned systems that collectively provide the same coverage without presenting a single lucrative target. The concept isn't new. The Navy's Collaborative Combat Aircraft program has been developing autonomous wingman drones for exactly this purpose. But those systems are optimized for air combat, not persistent surveillance. Adapting them for the ISR mission would require new sensor payloads, new data links, and new ground control architectures. Estimated timeline for initial operational capability: fiscal year 2029. 3 years. 3 years during which the Navy's high-altitude surveillance capability over Iran remains compromised by a single missile fired from a battery that wasn't supposed to be there. The crew at Point Mugu returned to operations the next day. Different aircraft. Different mission. Same screens. Same procedures. The mission commander who called Borealis down was reassigned to the review board. The operators continued flying the remaining Tritons in the Pacific theater, where the threat environment is different, but the underlying vulnerability is the same. Because the lesson of Borealis 7 isn't about Iran. It isn't about the Bavar 373. It isn't even about the Triton. The lesson is about assumptions. The United States built its entire ISR architecture on the assumption that it would always know where the threats were. That intelligence would be current. That satellites would see everything, that automated systems would classify correctly, that adversaries would stay where they were last photographed. None of those assumptions held on February 9th, 2026. Iran didn't defeat the Triton with superior technology. The Bavar 373 is capable, but it's not revolutionary. Iran defeated the Triton by understanding how America watches, and then moving where America wasn't looking. The sealed report sits in a classified vault at the Pentagon. The wreckage sits in an Iranian hangar. The gap in surveillance coverage sits over the Persian Gulf, widening every day the Triton doesn't fly. And somewhere in the Iranian desert, a Bavar 373 battery has already moved again. No one knows where it is now,